Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. I will get started right away and talk about the services that we have in community corrections for sex offenders. Start out with, as was stated, these trainings have been put together by the SART team. And so that's the group that's listed on the screen right now. And then I'm the last in the series of trainings. So my team includes 11 staff. And so we have various functions. We're somewhat specialized. I have 4 probation officers who conduct pre-sentence investigations. And those folks also supervise clients on probation. And typically what we do is we assign a PSI to a PO. They complete the investigation, and then when they're sentenced and placed on probation, they continue to supervise that individual through the majority of their high risk and the probation. If they move to low risk, then they'll move to someone else. I also have 2 probation officers that just work with supervised release, and those are people who are coming out of the institution. And so they specialize with that group, and that's kind of a different system and a different world. So having folks that are specialized in that is really helpful because we deal with the Department of Corrections and hearings and release for addressing violations. So it's just kind of a different system. I then have 3 probation officers who supervise our very high risk clients. Sex offenses are part of that. That's our ISR team. So they supervise a segment of the sex offender clients, most particularly right now, the level 3s. They're mandatory folks who go on to ISR. And then I have a part-time probation officer that assists those probation officers with field visits. And then as I kind of alluded to, I have 1 probation officer who supervises our low risk clients. And so that's typically our folks who have moved through their initial probation, have completed treatment, are usually in a good stable spot. And then we move them to the low risk person who sees them less often and monitors them until expiration of sentence, or possibly to such point that we seek a discharge for them. That person also handles our civilly committed clients. So all of those folks who are committed to MSOP are supervised by this probation officer who will have fairly low contact with those folks also. Usually I think it's twice a year. So our first point of contact typically with a client is when they are ordered to complete a pre-sentence investigation. And so we'll get that order from the court, and then that officer will meet with the client, review lots of materials, talk to collateral people, and complete the report that covers the things I have listed here. I'll make note that victim impact and restitution is a big piece of that. And so we will reach out to victims and get their input, see what they'd like to see happen with sentencing. One side note to that is we sometimes get ordered to do investigations that are called pre-plea. So they occur before the person has been found guilty or agrees to plead guilty to an offense. And then when those investigations are ordered, we're not able to contact the victim. So that's a big gap for us. So we obviously don't like pre-plea investigations because of that. Another issue is clients are not usually that willing to talk about the offense prior to them being found guilty or having entered a guilty plea to that. So pre-pleas are problematic for us. So we don't like to see them, but we get them on a pretty regular basis. Just to give people some background information, we have Minnesota sentencing guidelines in Minnesota, which kind of lay out our baseline for offenses. And there is a general criminal sex offender guideline grid, and then there's a specialized one for sex offenses. And that's what I'm showing you here today. And it goes by offense level and also criminal history. And you can see the shaded area is there because that's saying if the person lands in that area, they are presumptive stay. And if they land in the white area, they are presumptive commit to the institution. So sentencing recommendations with the PSI. So as I stated, the Minnesota sentencing guidelines kind of gives us that presumptive sentence. And then when we complete our investigation, we take into account big piece, what the victim would like to see happen, the client's position on the offense. Are they accepting responsibility for it? Are they feeling remorseful about the behavior? Their amenability to supervision or treatment. And we get at that. I didn't note it on the last slide. I'll go back to real quick, but our psychosexual assessment is a big piece of the investigation for us. And what we do is we refer clients to several of our contracted vendors for that evaluation. They are there to review the offense, do testing with the individual, and come up with recommendations for treatment options for that person. So that's very important for us when we're conducting the investigations. The other thing we look at, in addition to amenability to supervision and treatment, is we look for aggravating factors to the offense. So are there things that happen in the offense that make it much worse than the typical offense? Granted, all sex offenses are just horrible, but what we are looking for are things that make it that much more horrible, and that would be an aggravating factor. Mitigating factors are typically if somebody is amenable to treatment, they've completed a psychosexual, and the psychologist finds that they're amenable to treatment. The PO also feels that they're amenable, and so that'd be included as a mitigating factor. And so we take all of that into account when we are making our recommendations. So when we do come forward with a recommendation, we can depart from what the guidelines are. We can depart upward or downward. And what we do is we staff those cases with the team and then make a recommendation on if it meets our criteria for departure, either upward, downward, or what have you. All right, then what we'll see as far as conditions, there could be a ton of conditions that we order for an individual depending on their risk and responsivity needs. So these are just kind of probably the big ones that we'll see on most cases. Completed sex offender treatment is probably there 99% of the time. No contact with minors is very typical when the offense involved a minor. No victim contact is also very common that we see that. And again, we have contact with victims and see what they want to have ordered as far as that. There are times when victims share minor children, and then we have to work around those issues. So we try to be collaborative with the victim in addressing those. Some other typical ones are not allowing sexually explicit material or internet or social media. And again, what we do with those typically is those become treatment conditions. And if some treatment is going to be allowed down the road, they're going to have to reach a certain point in treatment when that condition can be modified. A big thing for us are polygraphs, and we require everyone on probation for a sex offense to complete an annual polygraph. And what we use that for is to just to verify that the information we're getting from the client is accurate. So if we have concern areas, we will definitely ask those questions on a polygraph. And if we find deception on polygraph, that becomes an issue for us, either in that we don't allow further movement on probation forward, or that if they acknowledge some of the deception, that can become a treatment issue or a violation, depending on the specific issue. But that's an invaluable tool for us across the board. The other thing, comply with predatory offender registration. So folks will have to do that while they're being supervised. Now, a typical probation term for us is 10 to 15 years. If it's a more serious offense, it can be longer. There are some sex offenses where it's a shorter term. Child pornography cases have a 5-year term max. So we're living with 5 years of supervision for folks convicted of that. If we do recommend an executed sentence and the person is sent to prison, most sex offense cases now carry a conditional release period. And that can be 5 or 10 years or lifetime. And so what conditional release really is a continuation of supervision with the caveat that there was a court ruling in the last couple of years where it indicated that you cannot just continue supervision from the initial period they were sent to prison and then on to conditional release, but there has to be a gap, a 1-day gap in between the two. But otherwise, all the conditions that were active and relevant when they were on or when they're placed on supervised release are relevant for conditional release. Now, as I stated earlier, our highest risk clients go to ISR and are supervised on that. Our level 3s remain on ISR throughout their supervision term. Now, that would be different if they were a level 3 that's on a probation term. They would not be supervised on ISR. They would be supervised by one of the high-risk agents. Clients are assigned level 3 by our end of confinement review committee, the ECRC committee, which is made up of a board of various stakeholders. And they are assigned that level before they come out of the institution for the most part. And if they're coming from another state, before they come to Minnesota from that other state. And as I stated, if they are a level 3, they stay on ISR for that entire term until it's expired or until their level is reduced. And a client can request a level reduction after 3 years, and then every 3 years after that. And once they're reduced to a level 2 or a level 1, they can be moved off of ISR. All right, supervision. We reach out to victims to update them when we assign a probation officer to the case. That again is usually going to be the same agent that conducted the pre-sentence investigation. So we are going to reach out, let them know who the PO is, let them know what the conditions are, and then make sure that we're addressing whatever needs or concerns that they have. We very typically work with victims to put safety plans in place, to deal with reunification if there's common children involved, or just any concerns that they would have. If there's safety concerns, we'll address that. We will work with them and make sure we can provide them as much services as possible. As far as the client goes, we typically see clients 1 to 2 times per month. And then if they're struggling, they're not complying with the rules of supervision, or they just need more contact with us, we'll see them more often than that. As I noted, ISR is the program we put the highest risk folks on. That's a pretty structured program. It's 3 phases. It's 1 year in duration for most everyone except for level 3s who will stay on it throughout. And then they have a 4-phase where we kind of phase back our contact with them after that first year. And then there's an additional 2 years that we kind of back off as long as the client is making progress or remaining stable. As again, I noted before, annual polygraphs are completed on all clients where it's court ordered or it's ordered by the supervised release agreement. Full disclosure polygraphs are something that we do typically as part of a treatment process. And what that is looking for is just to identify all previous victims so that we are making sure that we're aware of everyone who's been victimized by that client so we can address that in treatment. And so our biggest thing really is getting folks into and through sex offender treatment programs. We refer them based on their risk, need, and responsivity factors. We have 5 programs we contract with, and this is about some additional programs that are on this list. But what we try to do is to match up a program with the clients so they're gonna have the best chance for success. So we use a variety of programs in the area. And the ones who are contracted with are Project Pathfinder, New Path, Emergence, Alpha, and Alternatives Healing. And then we are working with another program we don't yet have a contract with, Life Development Resources. They're fairly new in sex offender treatment. We've been working with them for a couple of years as they develop a new sex offender treatment program. So we are closely aligned with them on trying to make sure that program meets all the needs of the clients and the needs that we have for them. And then CORE is another area, program that we use fairly often. It's kind of an outstate program, but with Scott County being close to us, we typically have clients who are involved with CORE. We have a budget to subsidize, help clients with payment costs for treatment, and we subsidize people based on their need. And so we typically require everyone to have some investment in treatment, so we don't pay for our treatment completely, although there are cases where somebody's just not able to afford it. We also try to get clients to use insurance when able, and sometimes we are referring clients to other insurance carriers that are going to be who will cover the sex offender treatment. It's not covered by all insurance, but it certainly has improved over the years. Sex offender treatment is a long-term treatment process. On average, we're seeing folks take 2.5 years to complete it, and it's quite in depth. And after that would be the primary phase of treatment. So it could be 2.5 years in primary, and then they would have some portion after that, 6 months to 12 months of aftercare, where they're continuing to go in and receive support and address any issues that come up. We do have inpatient treatment in the area, but we've only have one inpatient treatment program in the state. It's fairly cost prohibitive. So it's a daily rate of $104. That works out to about $38,000 a year. It's certainly not something we can put in our budget. So what we do is clients on probation would have to have the means and resources to pay for that inpatient treatment program, and that's at Alpha in Minneapolis. Otherwise, if they've been in prison and being released, the DOC does have a couple of beds that they pay for, but that's really difficult to get a client into. So that's fairly rare when we can get somebody in to Alpha on an inpatient basis for supervised release or ISR. Violations. So we've been really trying to move forward with trying to address violations in the community, to continue to work with people rather than taking them into custody and even executing a sentence, if that in the long run is not going to be beneficial or safer for the community. If we can address those issues in the community and keep the person working at going to treatment, then that's successful for the client, and that's successful for us too, because the client is less of a risk if they complete treatment. So we use a variety of things on probation. We use sanctions conferences, which is basically we have a limited set of sanctions we can impose for a violation behavior, be that use of chemicals or alcohol, or inappropriate use of the internet or computer. And then we can impose these conditions, and that's signed off on by the court. We also have apprehension and detention orders, where we can impose a term of up to 72 hours in custody at the local jail for any infraction. Those don't get used as often, but they are available and quite handy when you need to get somebody's attention and have pretty swift sanction. Otherwise, more formal violations, we submit a violation report to the court, and that would either be, we typically request that a summons be issued if the behavior is not concerning for public safety or client safety. Otherwise, we request a warrant to get that person in custody more immediately. Somewhat similar on supervised release, we do out of custody restructures, which is similar to a sanctions conference. It's signed off on by the hearings and release unit. And it's that unit that kind of serves the function of the judge. And they make the final call on if that's an appropriate resolution. And there's a lot more options available on restructures. We can use an apprehension and detention order, but that's really just to get the person in custody immediately. And then we typically have to follow that up with a warrant or a hold to keep them in custody. All violations for supervised release folks are held in custody. So the only thing that happens out of custody would be that out of custody restructure. Otherwise, if the person wants to argue their violation, they will have to be in custody And then a hearing would be held between the client. The client would have representation from the state public defender or private attorney if they wish, the probation officer, and then a hearing officer from the hearing and release unit. And in those instances, the probation officer basically prosecutes that violation. And then the hearing officer has the role of the judge and will find the person in violation and then make a determination as to the disposition. So those folks who are on supervised release are technically still under the authority of the Department of Corrections. And so they are in the community, but they can be pulled back into the institution. Again, the same philosophy for us exists, is if we can work with a person in the community, if they don't pose a risk to public safety or their own safety, we'll try to work with them in the community, because again, in the long run, I think that we're more successful and the client's more successful. Discharges. On probation, typically, clients will be discharged at the end of their imposed term of supervision. They can be discharged prior to that, and with that, they need to complete all the conditions that they were required to complete. They should have no issues at all with the victim. And typically with a lot of these cases, if they're on for 10 years, they've not really had any involvement with the victim for a number of years. So that is not usually an issue. We do have an internal review process for discharging. It's usually for these sex offense cases, it's myself and one of my colleague supervisors will review the case with the probation officer. And then if we agree to pursue an early discharge, the probation officer completes that paperwork and sends it in. And again, in the end, the judge signs off on that. Folks who reach their term of supervision, the max, so if it's the 5 years on a child porn and they've not yet completed their conditions, specifically treatment, we can extend them for up to an additional 3 years so that they can have time to complete treatment. On supervised release, there is no early discharge. Whatever they have remaining on their sentence, they'll have in addition to the conditional release. So basically, they'll have that entire term to complete. And as I stated earlier, the conditions that are imposed at supervised release continue through conditional release. There are some that may fall off. If they initially came out on ISR and completed that during their initial supervised release, then that's not held over them during their conditional release. They're treated as they've successfully completed that. All right, I think that covers everything that I wanted to get out there. Please let me know if there are questions.
Well, Mark, I was wondering, you mentioned the inpatient sex offender treatment and the outpatient. Have you found one is more beneficial or produces more results over the other?
Well, typically what we see is that we'll have most folks will go to outpatient. And if they're not successful outpatient, that's usually their, like CD treatment, they need a higher level of care. And so we would look to put more people in inpatient, but again, the resource is very limited. So what we typically do is if they're not successful in outpatient and they pose a risk, those folks are looking at going back to court to have their sentence executed.
Thank you.
Sure.
I really appreciate too, something that I heard you say multiple times is just the way that you stay in contact with the victim and, make sure that they're doing okay and not, there's not any follow-up happening with the offender. That is really important to me, that the victim is continuing to be protected. So I really appreciate that part of the program.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we have some cases, again, we come into the game pretty late. And so there's some cases where the victim is just done and we don't have a ton of involvement. And then there's other cases where the victim is very concerned for their safety, wants to stay very involved, and will do that. When there's a minor children involved and we're talking reunification, that becomes much more involvement in that. And we try to work closely with the victim and then the treatment providers, the reunification specialists, to try to get that to a point where everyone's in a better spot.
Yeah.
And just the other thing I'll throw out, which I didn't think I neglected, is that we also will, when a victim is concerned for safety, we'll try to put together safety plans and work with them. In addition to sending them out to you guys as a resource, but we'll try to work closely to develop things that are workable for victims.
Great. Okay, well, if no one has any other questions, then I think we can call it a day.